On a seemingly ordinary night in Las Vegas, December 10th, 1995, something extraordinary happened that would forever change the landscape of entertainment. Dean Martin, the king of cool himself, stepped onto the MGM Grand Stage for what no one knew would be his final bow. But halfway through his legendary performance, the unthinkable occurred. The man who had never missed a beat, never faltered in his delivery, suddenly stopped. The microphone fell silent. The audience held their breath. And Dean Martin, for the first time in his illustrious career, walked away from the spotlight. Forever. Tonight, we uncover the haunting truth behind that fateful evening when the music died. Dean Martin wasn't just a performer. He was an institution. Born Dino Paul Crescetti in Steubenville, Ohio, he had transformed himself from a small-town Italian-American boy into the epitome of effortless cool. By 1995, at the age of 78, Martin had conquered every entertainment medium imaginable. Music, movies, television, and the glittering stages of Las Vegas. His journey to superstardom had been nothing short of miraculous. From his early days as a crooner in smoky nightclubs to his legendary partnership with Jerry Lewis, Dean had always possessed that rare quality that separated stars from legends. He made everything look easy. Whether he was delivering a punchline, crooning a ballad, or sharing the screen with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, Dean Martin exuded a magnetic charm that seemed to flow from his very soul. The Las Vegas Strip had become his second home, a neon-lit kingdom where he reigned supreme for decades. Night after night, year after year, audiences flocked to see the man who could make them forget their troubles with just a smile and a song. His signature tune, That's Amor, had become more than just a hit record. It was a cultural phenomenon that defined an entire era of American entertainment. But behind the polished exterior and the seemingly endless confidence, Dean Martin was carrying burdens that the world could never have imagined. The man who made millions laugh was quietly battling demons that would ultimately lead to that shocking moment of silence that December night. Little did anyone know that the very qualities that made Dean Martin a legend, his need for perfection, his deep love for his family, and his unwavering commitment to his craft, were the same forces that would bring his career to such an abrupt and mysterious end. As 1995 dawned, Dean Martin found himself at a crossroads that few entertainers ever face. He had achieved everything a performer could dream of, yet the weight of his own legacy had become almost unbearable. The entertainment industry had changed dramatically since his golden years with the Rat Pack, and Dean was struggling to find his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. The new generation of performers looked to him as a living legend, but Dean saw himself as a relic of a bygone era. MTV dominated the airwaves. Rap music was revolutionizing popular culture, and the intimate, sophisticated style of entertainment that Dean had mastered was being relegated to nostalgia shows and oldies stations. The man who had once been at the forefront of American popular culture now felt like he was performing in a museum of his own making. His health had begun to deteriorate, though he kept this information closely guarded from the public and even from many of his closest friends. Chronic back pain, the result of decades of performances, and the physical demands of his craft, had become a constant companion. His trademark cigarettes and cocktails, once symbols of his cool persona, were now taking their toll on his aging body. More devastating than any physical ailment, however, was the emotional weight he carried. The death of his son Dean Paul Martin in 1987, killed in a military jet crash, had shattered something fundamental in Dean's spirit. Those closest to him noticed that the light in his eyes had dimmed, and the effortless joy that had characterized his performances had been replaced by something more mechanical, more forced. Yet Dean continued to perform because he didn't know how to do anything else. The stage had been his sanctuary for over 5 decades, and even as his body and soul cried out for rest, he couldn't imagine a life without the spotlight. The very idea of retirement felt like a kind of death to a man who had defined himself entirely through his ability to entertain others. The pressure to maintain his image as the eternally cool, unflappable Dean Martin had become exhausting. Every public appearance required him to summon reserves of energy and charisma that were becoming increasingly difficult to find. Las Vegas in 1995 was a city in transition, much like Dean Martin himself. The old Vegas that Dean had helped define, intimate showrooms, sophisticated audiences, and legendary performers holding court night after night, was giving way to mega casinos, family entertainment, and a new breed of spectacle it prioritized flashover substance. The MGM Grand, where Dean was scheduled to perform that December, represented this new Vegas perfectly. It was a massive, impersonal venue that could seat thousands, a far cry from the intimate settings where Dean had honed his craft. The Copa Room at the Sands, where the Rat Pack had made history, had been demolished years earlier, taking with it an irreplaceable piece of entertainment history. Dean felt like a stranger in this new landscape. The audiences were different, too. Many were tourists who knew his songs from oldies radio rather than fans who had lived through his golden years. They expected to see a performance, a recreation of the Dean Martin they had heard about, rather than the authentic experience that had made him famous in the first place. His management team, concerned about his recent lackluster performances, had been pressuring him to inject new energy into his act. They suggested updating his song list, incorporating more contemporary material, or even adding dancers and elaborate staging. But Dean resisted these changes, knowing instinctively that they would destroy the very essence of what made his performances special. The physical demands of performing in these new, massive venues were also taking their toll. The acoustics were different, the staging was more complex, and the sheer scale of the productions required an energy and presence that Dean was finding increasingly difficult to summon. What had once come naturally now required tremendous effort and concentration. In his private moments, Dean confided to close friends that he felt like he was performing his own funeral every night. The audiences came to see a legend, but he felt like a ghost of his former self. The disconnect between who he had been and who he was becoming had created an internal conflict that was eating away at his soul. In the days leading up to his December 10th performance, those working closest with Dean Martin noticed subtle but troubling changes in his behavior. His longtime musical director, who had worked with him for nearly 2 decades, later recalled that Dean seemed distracted during rehearsals, often losing his place in songs he had performed thousands of times. The rehearsals at the MGM Grand had been unusually tense. Dean, normally relaxed and easygoing during these sessions, appeared agitated and kept asking to run through certain songs multiple times. He would start a number, stop halfway through, and request to begin again, claiming he wasn't satisfied with his performance. This was completely out of character for a man known for his spontaneity and natural ease on stage. His backup singers noticed that Dean's voice, while still strong, seemed to carry a different quality. There was a weariness that hadn't been there before, a hesitation that was completely foreign to the confident performer they knew. During the sound check for Everybody Loves Somebody, Dean stopped mid-verse and stood silently at the microphone for nearly 30 seconds before asking the band to start over. The technical crew working the show later reported that Dean had made several unusual requests. He wanted the stage lighting to be dimmer than usual, claiming the bright lights were bothering his eyes. He also asked for a chair to be placed discreetly stage left, something he had never requested in previous performances. When asked about it, he simply said he might need to rest for a moment during the show. His personal assistant, who had been with him for over 10 years, noticed that Dean had been unusually quiet in the days before the performance. A man who typically filled backstage areas with jokes and laughter was introspective and distant. He spent long periods staring out windows, seeming lost in thoughts he shared with no one. Most telling of all, Dean had been carrying a small piece of paper in his jacket pocket, something he was observed looking at repeatedly during rehearsals. No one knew what was written on it, and Dean never showed it to anyone. It would later disappear, leaving behind only questions about what final thoughts or words might have been his last connection to the world he was preparing to leave behind. The MGM Grand was packed to capacity that December evening. The audience buzzed with anticipation, many having traveled from across the country to see the legendary Dean Martin perform live. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of energy that only comes when people know they're about to witness something special, something that connects them to a golden age of entertainment they feared was disappearing forever. Backstage, Dean Martin went through his usual pre-show routine, but those closest to him could sense something different. He was quieter than usual, more contemplative. He spent several minutes alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror, not with vanity, but with the searching gaze of a man trying to recognize himself in the face-looking. Back at 8:30 p.m., the house lights dimmed, and the orchestra began the familiar strains of his opening number. The crowd erupted in applause as Dean Martin walked onto the stage, that familiar smile spreading across his face. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed. He was still the king of cool, still the master of his domain. He opened with "Ain't That a Kick in the Head," his voice strong and sure, his movements fluid and natural. The audience was completely captivated, transported back to an era when entertainment felt more intimate, more real. Dean seemed to be finding his rhythm, connecting with the crowd in that magical way that had defined his career. For the first 45 minutes of the show, everything appeared normal. Dean moved through his classic repertoire with the ease of a master craftsman, each song delivered with the perfect blend of technical skill and emotional authenticity that had made him famous. The audience was eating up every moment, completely unaware that they were witnessing something historic. But as Dean began the opening notes of "That's Amor," the song that had become his signature and his burden, something shifted. His voice, which had been strong and confident, began to waver. Not with age or illness, but with something deeper, as if the weight of performing this song one more time had become more than he could bear. The moment that would change everything was approaching, and nobody in that packed theater could have predicted what was about to unfold. It happened during the second verse of "That's Amor." Dean Martin, the consummate professional who had never faltered in 5 decades of performing, simply stopped singing. The orchestra continued for a few bars, expecting him to come back in, but Dean remained silent at the microphone. The smile that had been his trademark slowly faded from his face, replaced by an expression that those who witnessed it would never forget. The audience initially thought it might be part of the act. Dean was known for his spontaneity, his ability to improvise and connect with crowds in unexpected ways. Some even began to chuckle, thinking he was setting up one of his famous ad-libs. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the laughter died away and was replaced by a confused, then concerned silence. Dean stood motionless center stage, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he was seeing them for the first time. Later, audience members would describe his expression as one of profound sadness mixed with a strange kind of peace, as if he had finally arrived at a decision he had been struggling with for months, perhaps years. The orchestra conductor, sensing something was wrong, gradually brought the music to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. 2,000 people holding their breath, waiting for an explanation that would never come. For nearly 2 full minutes, Dean Martin stood alone on that stage, surrounded by silence that seemed to stretch. Across decades of entertainment history, when Dean finally moved, it was with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. He gently placed the microphone back on its stand, straightened his tie with the same care he had always shown for his appearance, and looked out at the audience one final time. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not sad, but somehow final, as if he was saying goodbye to more than just one performance. Without a word of explanation, without the customary thank you and good night, Dean Martin walked slowly off the stage. His footsteps echoed in the absolute silence of the theater, each step taking him further away from the life that had defined him for over 50 years. The curtain fell, but it would never rise again for Dean Martin's career. The chaos that erupted backstage immediately following Dean's silent exit was unlike anything the MGM Grand had ever experienced. His management team rushed to his dressing room, expecting to find him collapsed or in medical distress. Instead, they found Dean sitting calmly in his chair, slowly removing his stage makeup as if nothing unusual had happened. When his manager burst through the door, demanding to know what was wrong, Dean simply looked up and said, "I'm done." The finality in his voice left no room for argument or negotiation. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a health scare. It was a decision that had been made with the certainty of a man who had finally found peace with an impossible choice. His longtime friend and musical director tried desperately to convince him to return to the stage. The audience was still seated, still waiting for an explanation or for the show to resume. "Just tell them you felt faint," he pleaded. "Tell them anything. They'll understand." But Dean shook his head slowly, continuing to methodically pack his personal items as if he were leaving for the last time. The venue's management was in panic mode. A theater full of paying customers sat in confused silence while staff tried to figure out how to handle a situation that had no precedent. How do you explain that one of the greatest entertainers in American history had simply decided to stop being an entertainer in the middle of a performance? Dean's personal physician was called immediately, convinced that only a serious medical emergency could explain such behavior. But when he arrived and examined Dean, he found nothing wrong, at least nothing that could be measured with medical instruments. Dean's vital signs were normal. His speech was clear, and his mental faculties appeared completely intact. The most haunting detail emerged from his dresser, who had been with Dean for years. As Dean prepared to leave that night, he carefully hung up his stage clothes and straightened them with unusual care. "Make sure these are cleaned properly," he said quietly. "Someone else might need them someday." It was as if he knew he would never wear them again, as if he was preparing his legacy for someone else to carry forward. Within hours of Dean Martin's unprecedented departure from the MGM Grand stage, the machinery of public relations kicked into overdrive. The initial statement, hastily prepared by his management team and approved by Dean himself, cited exhaustion and the need for rest as the reason for the abrupt end to the performance. It was a safe, believable explanation that the media and public readily accepted. The refund process for that evening's show became a logistical nightmare, but it also revealed the deep affection audiences had for Dean. Many ticket holders refused refunds, saying they wanted to keep their tickets as souvenirs of witnessing history. Others who had traveled from across the country to see the show expressed genuine concern for Dean's well-being rather than anger about the canceled performance. In the days that followed, Dean's representatives released additional statements, emphasizing that this was not a retirement announcement, but simply a temporary break. They spoke of future touring plans, recording projects, and Dean's continued commitment to his fans. These statements, while well-intentioned, would prove to be completely false. Dean Martin would never perform publicly again. The entertainment media, surprisingly, showed unusual restraint in their coverage of the incident, perhaps recognizing that they were dealing with a genuine legend whose contribution to American culture deserved respect. Most outlets focused on celebrating Dean's incredible career rather than speculating about what had gone wrong that December night. Behind the scenes, however, the truth was far more complex than the official statement suggested. Dean had made his decision not in a moment of weakness or illness, but in a moment of absolute clarity. Those closest to him knew that no amount of rest or medical treatment would bring him back to the stage, because the problem wasn't physical, it was spiritual. The carefully constructed narrative of temporary exhaustion served everyone's purposes. It allowed Dean to maintain his dignity while stepping away from public life. It gave the industry time to process the loss of one of its greatest stars, and it provided fans with hope that their hero might someday return. But those who knew Dean best understood that December 10th, 1995, marked the end of an era in American entertainment, not the real story behind. Dean Martin's silent exit from the MGM Grand Stage was far more profound and heartbreaking than the public ever knew. In the months leading up to that December evening, Dean had been experiencing what those closest to him would later describe as a spiritual crisis, a fundamental questioning of everything that had given his life meaning. The death of his son Dean Paul had affected him far more deeply than anyone realized. Dean Paul had been following in his father's footsteps, pursuing a career in entertainment while also serving as a pilot in the California Air National Guard. When his F-4 Phantom II crashed into Mount San Gorgonio in March 1987, it didn't just take Dean's son. It took his faith in the future, his belief that the entertainment he provided actually mattered in a world where real tragedy could strike without warning. For 8 years, Dean had continued performing, but each show became more of a struggle. The joy he had once found in connecting with audiences had been replaced by a growing sense of emptiness. He began to question whether his entire career had been built on helping people escape from reality rather than face it, whether he had spent decades as an enabler of denial rather than a purveyor of joy. The specific catalyst for his December 10th decision came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the show, Dean had received a letter from a fan, a woman whose husband had recently died, leaving her alone with 2 young children. She wrote that Dean's music had been one of the few things that could still make her smile, that listening to his recordings helped her believe that happiness was still possible, even in the darkest times. Rather than being uplifted by this letter, Dean was devastated by it. He realized that this woman, and thousands like her, were depending on him to provide something he no longer possessed: genuine joy, authentic happiness, real hope. He felt like a fraud, a man pretending to be something he was no longer capable of being. That night on stage, as he began singing "That's Amor," Dean was overwhelmed by the realization that he couldn't continue living a lie. The words of the song, which he had sung thousands of times, suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. The audience's expectation that he would make them feel good became an unbearable pressure that he simply couldn't carry anymore. The entertainment industry's reaction to Dean Martin's sudden departure was unlike anything that had been seen before or since. This wasn't a retirement announcement with farewell tours and tribute shows. It was the immediate, complete withdrawal of one of the most important figures in American popular culture. The shockwaves reverberated from Las Vegas to Hollywood to New York, leaving industry professionals struggling to understand what had happened and what it meant. Frank Sinatra, Dean's longtime friend and fellow Rat Pack member, was reportedly devastated by the news. Those close to Sinatra said he took Dean's decision as a personal betrayal, not because Dean had quit performing, but because he had made such a monumental decision without consulting the friend who had shared so many stages with him over the decades. Sinatra's own performances in the months following December 10th were noticeably subdued, as if he too was questioning the meaning of continuing without his partner in entertainment. The Las Vegas entertainment community was particularly shaken. Dean Martin hadn't just been a performer on the Strip. He had been a cornerstone of what Las Vegas represented. His withdrawal felt like a fundamental shift in the city's identity, a signal that the era of legendary entertainers who made Vegas their home might be coming to an end. Younger performers who had looked to Dean as a role model found themselves questioning their own career paths. If someone as accomplished and seemingly content as Dean Martin could suddenly decide it was all meaningless, what did that say about the entertainment industry as a whole? Some veteran performers privately admitted that Dean's decision had forced them to confront their own doubts about the value and purpose of their work. The media struggled to find an appropriate framework for understanding and reporting on what had happened. Entertainment journalism was accustomed to covering scandals, health crises, and career setbacks. But Dean's situation didn't fit into any familiar category. He wasn't sick, he wasn't in trouble, and he wasn't angry. He had simply decided to stop being who he had always been. Record labels and booking agents began quietly reassessing their strategies for older performers, wondering if other legendary entertainers might be experiencing similar crises of faith. The incident highlighted the tremendous pressure placed on performers to continue being the people their audiences needed them to be, regardless of what was happening in their personal lives. To understand the significance of Dean Martin's silent departure, it's essential to understand the complex relationship between the public persona and the private man. Dean Martin, the entertainer, was a carefully constructed character, smooth, unflappable, perpetually amused by life's absurdities. But Dino Crocetti, the man behind the legend, was far more complex and vulnerable than his audience ever suspected. From his earliest days in show business, Dean had possessed an almost supernatural ability to make performance look effortless. This gift, while making him one of the most beloved entertainers of his generation, had also created a prison of expectations. People didn't just want Dean Martin to entertain them. They needed him to make them believe that life could be as smooth and carefree as he made it appear. The burden of this expectation had grown heavier with each passing year. Dean was acutely aware that his audience came to his shows not just for entertainment, but for reassurance that style and sophistication still mattered, that humor could triumph over hardship, that some things in life remained constant even as the world changed around them. This responsibility weighed on him far more than most people realized. In his private life, Dean was actually quite different from his public persona. He was a devoted father who worried constantly about his children, a thoughtful man who read voraciously and thought deeply about philosophy and religion, and someone who struggled with the same insecurities and fears as everyone else. The gap between who he really was and who people expected him to be had grown increasingly difficult to bridge. His closest friends knew that Dean had always been somewhat melancholy beneath his entertaining exterior. He possessed a deep sensitivity that made him acutely aware of suffering, both his own and that of others. This sensitivity, while contributing to his ability to connect emotionally with audiences, also made him vulnerable to the pain and disappointment that inevitably comes with a long life. The death of his son had shattered Dean's carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. For the first time in his life, he experienced a grief so profound that his usual coping mechanisms, humor, music, performance, proved inadequate. The man who had spent decades helping others escape from their troubles found himself trapped in a sorrow he couldn't perform his way out of. After December 10th, 1995, Dean Martin retreated into a privacy so complete that it bordered on Hermitage. The man who had once been one of the most visible figures in American entertainment became virtually invisible, emerging from his Beverly Hills home only for the most essential activities. It was as if he had decided not just to stop performing, but to stop being a public figure entirely. Those few friends who were granted access to Dean during these final years described a man who seemed to be slowly fading away, not from illness, but from a kind of spiritual exhaustion. He spent his days listening to music, reading, and watching old movies, particularly those featuring performers from his era who are no longer alive. It was as if he was keeping vigil for a world that no longer existed. Dean's family became increasingly concerned about his withdrawal from life. His children tried repeatedly to engage him in activities, to coax him back into some form of social interaction. But Dean seemed to have made peace with his solitude, in a way that worried them deeply. He wasn't depressed in a clinical sense. He was simply done with the effort required to maintain relationships and engage with the world. The entertainment industry made numerous attempts to lure Dean back, even for small appearances or tribute shows. Offers came from every major venue and television network, many proposing astronomical sums for just a single performance. Dean declined them all politely, but firmly, making it clear that his decision was final and not subject to negotiation. Perhaps most tellingly, Dean stopped listening to recordings of his own performances. His housekeeper later revealed that he had packed away all of his albums, awards, and memorabilia in boxes that were stored in a spare room. It was as if he wanted to distance himself, not just from performing, but from the memory of ever having been a performer god in his final years. Dean found solace in simple pleasures, watching television, enjoying quiet meals, and spending time with his grandchildren, who were too young to understand the magnitude of his fame. With them, he could simply be a grandfather rather than a legend, and those moments seemed to provide him with the only real peace he found during his final years. Just 15 days after his silent departure from the MGM Grand Stage, Dean Martin faced what would be his most difficult Christmas ever. For decades, the holiday season had been synonymous with his music. Silver Bells, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, and countless other holiday classics had made Dean's voice as much a part of Christmas as decorated trees and wrapped presents. But Christmas 1995 would pass without Dean Martin's voice being raised in song. His family gathered at his Beverly Hills home, hoping that the warmth and tradition of Christmas might somehow reach through the wall of silence he had built around himself. They played his Christmas recordings, hoping to spark some recognition of the joy he had once brought to millions during the holiday season. But Dean listened to his own voice as if it belonged to a stranger, with the detached interest of someone hearing a historical recording rather than a reflection of his own artistic legacy. The contrast was heartbreaking for those who remembered. The Dean Martin of Christmases past. This was the man who had hosted legendary holiday parties, who had filled television screens with Christmas specials that became family traditions, who had recorded holiday albums that defined the season for an entire generation. Now he sat quietly in his living room, seemingly unmoved by the very music that had made Christmas magical for millions of families. His children and grandchildren tried to engage him in holiday traditions, but Dean participated with the polite detachment of a guest at someone else's celebration. He went through the motions of opening gifts and sharing meals, but the spark that had once made him the life of every gathering was simply gone. It was as if the man who had personified celebration and joy had lost the ability to feel either emotion. The most poignant moment came when his youngest grandson asked him to sing Jingle Bells. Dean looked at the child with infinite tenderness, but simply shook his head, unable to explain that the voice that had once brought so much happiness to the world had finally run out of songs. The silence that had begun on the MGM Grand Stage had become complete and total. That Christmas Day marked the beginning of what his family would later describe as Dean's long goodbye, a gradual withdrawal from life itself that would continue for the remaining years he had left. It was as if he had used up all of his capacity for joy and service to others, and had nothing left for himself, not in the months following Dean Martin's withdrawal from public life. The entertainment industry struggled to come to terms with the loss of one of its most defining figures, while that figure was still alive. It was an unprecedented situation. How do you mourn someone who is still breathing, but has chosen to become a ghost of their former self? Tribute shows and retrospectives began appearing with increasing frequency, but they had an odd, funeral-like quality that felt premature and somehow wrong. Performers who had worked with Dean found themselves in the strange position of speaking about him in the past tense while knowing he was still alive, watching television in his Beverly Hills home. The usual language of tribute and remembrance felt inadequate and inappropriate. Frank Sinatra, in what many considered to be his final great performance, dedicated an entire concert to Dean Martin songs, telling the audience, "My friend is still with us, but the music has left the building." The emotion in Sinatra's voice as he struggled through "Everybody Loves Somebody" left few dry eyes in the house, and none of the smooth confidence that had characterized the Rat Pack years. Younger performers, who had never met Dean but had been influenced by his work, began incorporating his songs into their acts, creating a strange phenomenon where Dean Martin's music was being performed everywhere except by Dean Martin himself. It was as if the entertainment world was trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled, to replace an irreplaceable presence with collective effort and good intentions. The Grammy Awards that year included a lengthy tribute segment to Dean Martin, even though he was very much alive. The awkwardness of the situation was palpable. How do you present a Lifetime Achievement Award to someone who has explicitly rejected their lifetime of achievement? The award was accepted by his son Richie, who spoke movingly about his father's legacy while carefully avoiding any mention of his current state. Perhaps most significantly, the tribute attempts highlighted just how unique Dean Martin's contribution to entertainment had been. Other performers could sing his songs, but they couldn't replicate the ineffable quality that had made Dean special. That sense that he was sharing a private joke with each member of his audience, that he was letting them in on the secret of how to move through life with style and grace. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995, exactly 1 year after that silent Christmas when his voice had finally stilled forever. But in many ways, the Dean Martin the world loved had already died on the stage of the MGM Grand, in that moment when he chose silence over song, authenticity over performance, truth over the beautiful lie he had been living for over 50 years. The official cause of death was acute respiratory failure, but those who knew Dean best understood that he had died of something that no medical textbook could diagnose: a broken spirit, a soul that had given so much of itself to others that nothing remained for the man who had housed it. He had loved too deeply, performed too completely, and cared too much about making others happy to save anything for himself. His funeral was attended by every major figure in entertainment, but it felt more like a celebration of something that had ended a year earlier than a mourning for something that had just been lost. The real Dean Martin, the performer, the legend, the man who could make the whole world smile, had been buried in silence on that December night when he walked away from the spotlight forever. The legacy Dean Martin left behind is complex and multi-layered. He proved that entertainment at its highest level is not just about technical skill or professional competence, but about the willingness to give something essential of yourself to strangers who need what you have to offer. He also demonstrated the terrible cost that such generosity can exact from those who practice it most completely. In the end, Dean Martin's silent exit from the MGM Grand stage stands as one of the most profound moments in entertainment history. Not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about the price of bringing joy to others and the courage it takes to choose authenticity over expectation. even when that choice means disappointing millions of people who depend on you for their happiness. The story of Dean Martin's final performance reminds us that behind every legend is a human being, vulnerable and finite, carrying burdens that their audience never sees. That December night in 1995, when Dean Martin chose silence over song, he gave us perhaps his greatest performance, not as an entertainer, but as a man finally choosing to be true to himself, rather than to our expectations of him. His decision to walk away teaches us that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to stop being what everyone else needs them to be and start being who they actually are. Dean Martin's silence spoke louder than any song he ever sang, reminding us that authenticity, even when it disappoints, is more valuable than the most beautiful performance built on a foundation of emptiness. The day Dean Martin went silent on stage was the day we lost not just a great entertainer, but a piece of our collective innocence, the belief that our heroes are somehow immune to the pain and struggle that define the human experience. In losing that innocence, however, we gained something perhaps more valuable, the understanding that true artistry comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to share our imperfect humanity with others. What do you think? Did Dean Martin's silent exit represent the death of an era, or the birth of a new understanding of what it means to be authentic in a world that demands performance? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Untold Stories from the Golden Age of Entertainment.